biggest things to look at in therapy, where you're stuck. So if you're repeating, what is happening? Why have you become stuck? And the things that you're not saying, what are you avoiding? What are you not saying or looking at? You're in a really emotionally heightened state. Do something that requires logic and thinking, because they're two different parts of the brain. And the emotional part can take over and become really loud. If we can do something where we need to use the logic side, it can take you out of the heightened emotion and actually calm things down. And actually, music, interestingly, has been found to help with cravings. So if people are craving things or they're in emotional distress and looking to use something like drugs or alcohol to get out, actually putting on music can change your emotional state too. There's this theory that we look for a happy ending by repeating the same pattern over and over again. So we will go back into a similar kind of relationship each time in the hope that this time we'll win. And unfortunately, if we're drawn to the same kind of people with the same kind of issues, that's probably not going to happen.
Welcome to the Collaborative Resource Hub by Wellness Provisions. Our mission is to bridge the gap between mental health, wellness, and music, specifically rock and roll. I'm Amy McBride, owner of Wellness Provisions, the most badass wellness business. Wellness Provisions supplies rock and rollers with high-quality supplements. We give you a trustworthy place to go where you can essentially shop blindfolded. Our wellness kits were created out of a need to simplify your shopping experience and make it stress-free. You'll get the most effective nutrients in the least amount of bottles with the least trial and error. Immerse yourself in the Collaborative Resource Hub by going to our website, where you'll have access to helpful resources that can nudge you in the right direction. Let's inspire each other. If that guy did it, so can you. Find the Collaborative Resource Hub interviews on YouTube, all major podcast platforms, and get cool music and wellness perks by supporting us on Patreon. Last but not least, my legal disclaimer: nothing in this interview or the Collaborative Resource Hub substitutes medical advice. Please connect with your GP if you need medical guidance. Katie Evans, welcome here to the Collaborative Resource Hub. I'm so excited to have you as a guide interview for this, super, super excited.
Cool. No, thank you for having me. This is such an awesome project. I love it. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. So for people, obviously, if they're not familiar with you, you're a therapist, you have your own private practice for counseling, and then you just started a podcast, which I still need to listen to the last werewolf episode. And you have a book coming up, so you want to speak to those?
Yeah, so my main kind of day job, I guess, is I'm a therapist. I was working out of London, recently moved back to Liverpool, which is the north of England, and pretty much online, so seeing people from all over the world, which is brilliant. And my specialities within that are gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity. So I work a lot with different genders, different sexualities, different types of relationships. So sort of very poly-aware, that not everyone needs to have traditional kind of relationships. Also looking at kink and sex worker aware therapy as well. So I wanted to have a practice where anyone could access and didn't feel that something was going to hold them back or they were going to feel judged. So it's about making mental health as available as possible. And I come from a background looking at addiction. So I kind of use that a lot. I work a lot with people who are caught up in using crystal meth and GHB and methadone, which are the kind of big chemsex drugs over here.
Yeah.
So that's another area of speciality that I kind of work in. And then I guess my kind of podcast is my other area, which is monsters and horror. So I wanted to bring everything together. And I run a podcast called Mental Health Monsters, which ties in with the book, which is going to be the Monster Guide to Mental Health.
Okay.
And that's all about bringing horror and monsters together and using that to explain and kind of explore different mental health. So it's all about
making like analogies or just drawing like the similarities.
Yeah, so it came from when I've had mental health problems since I was like 13, 14. Luckily, I'm the best I've ever been now through having a lot of therapy myself and kind of exploring things for me. But I had a lot of depression, anxiety, trauma, and horror really helped me. I think it was always, it doesn't sound like the most obvious thing to help, but I found it really, really useful. So what I do is I talk about the monsters and how they kind of tied into different mental health things that I struggled with. So like Dracula is compulsion, and then the werewolf there's anger, but also sexuality, because I think there's a big kind of sexuality element to werewolves and what we hide inside.
Yeah.
And then I've got one coming up about The Invisible Man, which is about trauma and abuse. So they can be quite heavy topics,
Yeah.
but they're done in a way that hopefully makes them quite accessible.
So what are some of the key kind of like, I mean, if it's a spoiler alert for The Invisible Man, like what are some of those that you talk about?
So the idea with the invisible man is what is seen and unseen. And so the abuse part I look at, partly tied in with the new Invisible Man film, which is about emotional abuse and mental abuse and gaslighting. But also there is a lot of abuse which is covert emotional abuse. It's something we don't necessarily see or spot straight away. So kind of discussing how that can run underneath a relationship and how that can affect and how to spot that
So
and
like kind of
advice.
a subtle manipulation or something?
It starts off so things like love bombing, which would be you feel really, really special to that person. So they might say they love you really, really quick. They constantly messaging you, constantly telling you you're perfect and amazing. Well, what that is breaking down boundaries and it's kind of pulling you in. So how things like that can be seen as one thing, but actually underneath it's something else. So how to spot that?
Yeah. Do you think, because I guess I've always, I mean, the people that are, for example, doing the love bombing or the people that are doing the gaslighting, I mean, like, are they aware that they do that? I mean, like, are they aware that are they like consciously trying to manipulate someone, or it's such a pattern from their own, traumas?
Yeah, it's complex. I think for some people they're aware and it is a kind of manipulative process that they are doing to get the person where they want them to be. Others, it might just come from a real fear of loss or rejection. So they want to kind of hold the person like this. Like they
Mhm.
really, really want to hold on to them tight. Um, and they use certain techniques to get that person and feel like they're not going to get away.
Yeah.
So I think it's kind of on an individual basis to be looked at, but it can be a mix of both.
I guess when you've worked with people, do they, if they're the ones being kind of, being the ones who are being manipulated in whatever way, is it easy for them to sort of notice it when you start giving them, the clues or what to look for? Or is it often that they still have trouble recognizing it?
Again, it can be a mix. I think sometimes people would rather believe that the relationship is fine and they're the one with the issue because that means they can fix it easier. It's kind of like a control thing. If I feel like I'm the one that's got the issue and if I change, everything will be fine, it feels a bit easier because then you can kind of control what's going on for you. So that can create a bit of denial or a bit of seeing things in a different way. Other times, if you point something out and say, do you realize actually that this is a technique, or do you realize this can be something that's used in abuse? Then it kind of starts to slot together the different pieces.
Inter-
So when you're talking to somebody, you've just got to go at their rate, really, because you can't push someone away by saying, oh, you're being abused,
Right.
because they'll run.
Right.
So just sit with somebody and let them kind of come to their own conclusion or their own place. And, it's not for me to tell them what they need to do in a relationship, but just give them the space to explore it, maybe a bit of the information that they might need, and then they do things at their own pace.
Yeah. What's interesting though is they would still even have the power to fix it themselves by recognizing it and creating better boundaries. So
Yeah, I mean, working on boundaries is one of the biggest things that I do. I think every single client that comes to me ends up talking about boundaries, sometimes more than they want. I'm like, "We're going back to boundaries." But, and it's hard because if someone is being manipulated, if they're gonna find it really, really hard to put boundaries in place. It can
right.
be a really scary thing to do. And sometimes the biggest boundary you can put in is to walk away, which is, it's a hard one to do, I know, but sometimes that's the best one. But there's actually a really good book that I give everybody, which is by Adeline Birch, which is all about boundaries after a pathological relationship, which is what it's actually called. It's called Boundaries After a Pathological Relationship. But it's really good. It tells you like your human rights in a relationship, what you're entitled to, what to look out for, and it tells you how to set boundaries, signs that they might be wobbly, and that's brilliant. It's just a really short little book. That's
Oh,
a really good one for understanding that.
oh, cool. Yeah, because it's hard. I feel like you have to hit. I mean, this is like how I've been in a couple relationships. It's like I've had to like hit like a rock bottom, whatever that rock bottom is, to be like, I can't keep putting myself through this kind of ringer or getting this kind of like psychological, like, whiplash.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really hard one. Often there's this theory that we look for a happy ending by repeating the same pattern over and over again. So we will go back into a similar kind of relationship each time in the hope that this time we'll win. And unfortunately, if we're drawn to the same kind of people with the same kind of issues, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a tricky one that people can find themselves in a loop. And it's really important that people know that so they don't beat themselves up and think, oh, it's just me. I just keep doing the same thing. And
Yeah.
often it's a
So
lot more complex than that.
are there, I mean, is there anything, I guess, specifically that someone can do, whatever their loop is, whether it's relationships to humans or substances or whatever, how can you sort of like what can you wedge in there to kind of start breaking up that cycle?
First thing is awareness of realizing that it is a loop. That's really the most important thing that you can do. It often goes back to childhood, which a lot of us don't like to acknowledge because it's difficult because then it involves looking perhaps at family or early events or early childhood. But if you can start to see what it is you're looking to get at the end, you can kind of work backwards from that and break that cycle. So we often look at substance use as like being in a toxic relationship. So if you have an addiction with alcohol or drugs, it's like being in that relationship where it might have felt really good the first time you were there, and then you stay in the relationship and it starts to hurt you, but you stay hoping that somehow it'll get back to how it was. And it doesn't, particularly with drug and alcohol. When it gets to the addiction stage, it's really not going to go back to being beneficial to you. It's going to end up hurting you. So it's about realizing what are you in that cycle for? What are you aiming to find? And then finding alternative ways of getting that that might work better for you.
So replacing a poor addiction with a healthier one, I guess.
Yeah, just finding, so sometimes it's about people going because they want to. The main thing with drugs and alcohol is they change the way we feel.
Hmm.
They're a really quick fix to changing an emotion, and we like to feel that we have control over our emotions or anything, sex or pornography or shopping or
Right.
whatever it is that you use. You feel one way, so like anxious or sad, you do this thing and you suddenly feel happy or excited or high or whatever it is that you get from it. So you think you can change that emotion. So if you look at the emotion you're aiming for, how can you get that in a different way? And it
Hmm.
can take a little bit of work, but kind of realizing how can I get this in a kind of what we'd say healthier
Yeah.
way?
Yeah.
And you can kind of look at the root cause underneath and sort of figure out what might have started it in the first place.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, so it's, I mean, it's a dopamine thing, like with the chemicals in the brain, right? So how
Yeah.
else can you find a healthier dopamine lift?
Yeah, and dopamine generally reduces our serotonin, so we're replacing happiness with pleasure.
Right.
We like pleasure, it's good, but we don't want to just go for that. We want to get that kind of stable base of happiness
Hmm.
underneath, and that's going to be through more long-term things because
Yeah.
that's more of a slow builder.
Are there any long-term things that I guess if there's a general way to answer it that you find help the most amount of people, that they respond well with?
Exercise is a good one, although it can in itself lead to an addiction. So you've got to be a bit careful. But exercise and movement is a really, really good one because it does release natural kind of happy chemicals in the brain and it reconnects you with your body, which is important. So you're kind of getting, if you have any trauma as well, reconnecting to your body is really important, experiencing that in a different way. Um, and actually, music, interestingly, has been found to help with cravings. So if people are craving things or they're in emotional distress and looking to use something like drugs or alcohol to get out, actually putting on music can change your emotional state too. So actually, music has been found to help with cravings and addiction, which is fascinating. So when we're feeling sad, we try and feed that sadness. We'll watch a really sad movie or we'll listen to really sad music, and music can do a similar thing as changing our emotional state. So actually, we can switch things in the brain over by listening to something happy or listening to something that's perhaps a different kind of feel to it.
Yeah.
We can move the feeling again, so we can learn to kind of manage emotions and regulate through music.
Yeah. So then that would be a little tip then if you're don't play the music that matches your emotion. Play a 180.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, sometimes if I'm feeling a bit, grumpy, putting on some angry music can be a bit of a release. I do like it,
I
so,
did that decades ago.
yeah, so you can do that too, but just we have a habit if you're feeling depression, we can kind of feed that with sad music, or feeling anxious, we can kind of put on things that feed that anxiety. Whereas if we put on something calming or happy, whatever your happy might be, it doesn't have to be kind of cheesy pop. It can be whatever makes you happy.
Right, right.
Um, then that can kind of help break the loop that you're stuck in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any, because I had asked you this sort of ahead of time, what are the top 3 things within your area of expertise that you found to help the most amount of people? And you have put down life experience, humanity, and then non-judgmental spaces.
Yeah. So I'm, quite proud of the fact that I guess I've been through a bit of stuff in life. And so I know that I've learned through living stuff as much as reading it in books. I think a lot of therapists are drawn to therapy because you've been through something.
Mhm.
Um, and I think actually we can use that as a connection. I quite believe in the kind of Jungian wounded healer. I quite like that idea that we can kind of use our own wounds to connect with people. So I find that's actually really useful. And what that does is create that kind of humanity side, which I think is important. Um, because I know traditionally therapists would be about a blank canvas. So there'd be just something to reflect ideas off. I'm not,
Yeah,
unfortunately. You can kind of tell by looking at me that I'm not a blank canvas. And I've had some interesting comments. But I think actually using that humanity in the room can be a really important element to helping people kind of normalize what they're going through.
mhm,
I'm not going to tell them my problems. That's not what they're there for, but just kind of within the work bring in some of that kind of more human element and keep it quite equal and like it's a mutual process. So
mhm.
I think that's really important in helping people. And then non-judgmental spaces is what I'm all about. Like we need to have spaces where people can access what they need without fear of stigma, because that's going to be the biggest block to going into therapy.
Yeah,
It's huge for people that they're going to feel misunderstood. They might have to explain themselves. They might feel that they're told to live a different kind of lifestyle than they want to live in terms of, you know, types of relationship or traditional life markers, or, so marriage, kids, own a house, that's not for everybody. So being pushed down that route might not feel where people want to go. So if we can open the right spaces, that's going to
yeah,
helpfully get mental health help to more people.
yeah, and sort of I guess, yeah, explore that and realize, because that's something that I've struggled with is,
Right.
uh, I know I'm sort of like, "Here's the box, I'm over here."
Right.
Then
Okay.
it's like every so often I find myself thinking like, "Oh, I'm supposed to be buying a house and getting married." So, like, I do those things, and then I'm like, "I am not happy." And then but it's hard because you sort of I feel like it's easy to get caught up in society and what you're supposed to be doing,
Yeah. It's really interesting, like a really an age of people that are coming into therapy a lot to explore things are in their 30s, because there's this tradition, I guess, like my parents, they were kind of settled and married and had me and seemed to have everything together by the time they were 30. Whereas me, I was like, I don't know what I'm doing, like, what's happening in my life. So a lot of people are experiencing 30s quite differently. They're feeling like, well, I don't really want what my parents had, but I've been told this is what I need to do to show that I'm successful or normal,
mhm,
quote, or, I've got things sorted. I mean, that doesn't have to be the case.
yeah,
Life doesn't quite work like that anymore.
yeah. What do you feel about, like, mindfulness or meditation or, breath work or things like that, in general, or if someone struggles perhaps with, like, anxiety or something?
They're so good. When I got told to try mindfulness, before I'd learned how to do it properly, I was like, "No, no, it's not for me." I have a really fast-paced mind. I always wanted to be doing things. So I was like, the idea of sitting with myself terrified me. I didn't like the idea of it, but I actually think it's hugely valuable now. It's a really important thing, and breathing can be so powerful, particularly if you have trauma.
Mhm.
So learning to breathe, if you put your hands on your ribs and really kind of breathe deeply and push them in and out as you breathe, and you breathe in for 3, hold it for 3, and then breathe out for 6, like a really deep slow breath for 6. That slows the brain down. So when you're having a trauma response, that's gonna slow the brain, take you out of fight and flight, so it breaks that anxiety.
Mhm.
For any anxiety, that kind of breathing's really, really good because it actually changes the way the brain works.
Yeah, and I guess it's just a matter of if you breathe, if you work on breath work regularly, then when you find yourself in a heightened state, kind of caught off guard, it's easier to practice it at that
Yeah,
time, right?
hugely. That was a really good one, and tapping I found helps a lot of people. So tapping the acupuncture points on the top of the head, certain ones on the face,
Yeah,
on the breastbone, and here in the hand.
yeah.
Um,
How much
that's
do
really
you
good
know
too.
about that?
So I learned about it through having it, through, my therapist used to do it with me, and then I looked into how to do it as well. And it's just really good. It just if you say a kind of mantra as you do it and tapping on the certain points, it just calms you right down.
Yeah,
It can bring up emotions sometimes,
I've
depending
heard,
on what you say.
yeah, I've heard it's really good for just, I mean, I guess specifically PTSD.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
interesting.
it's really good. I mean, I do it with clients in sessions sometimes. Um, and it's interesting what comes up for them. Sometimes it can just kind of calm them down and they can feel really a lot more comfortable with things. Other times they kind of get into a place that they weren't expecting and it allows them to release the tears or release something. So it can be quite a powerful tool to have.
Yeah,
Yeah.
um, interesting. Um, are there any other sort of like, I don't know what you would call that, modalities or something that other ones that people can kind of look at to try and integrate?
And when it comes to trauma, certain things like just reminding yourself what day it is and what year it is and how old you are. Which sounds really simple, but what it does is it reminds yourself where you are. Trauma is when we feel somewhere in our mind that we're still stuck in a certain time in the past. So even just by reminding yourself of who you are and where you are and when it is, that can take you out of that. Or doing something when you're in a really emotionally heightened state, do something that requires logic and thinking because they're two different parts of the brain and the emotional part can take over and become really loud. If we can switch over and do something like a puzzle or watch a quiz show or do something where we need to use the logic side, it can take you out with a heightened emotion and actually calm things down. So just something like that can work really well. Yeah.
I'm so fascinated by this, and I'm thinking like, oh, I got to think of a question fast enough to follow up with this, but I don't know. I just think it's so interesting. The brain is just, oh my god, it's so interesting. And I don't know. Another thing, I mean, it's just like a random thing. Is just ego versus like, your heart or like your intuitive. I don't, and that those because they're separate.
Yeah.
And I don't even know about like what I'm saying, but just yeah, how the brain works and how yeah.
It's so fascinating because I guess I started off looking more at the mind and kind of looking at how the mind will hold certain memories and experiences. And then when you start looking at the brain and how it processes everything, so we will have a kind of default quick route that it goes to when it goes into panic or when something happens, where it doesn't process everything. It just goes, "This is what I do. I run, or I freeze, or I fight, or I use this thing," or it can really quickly do something. And we're not always aware of that, of how quick it's sending us into a certain mode. So if we can start to figure out how our brain works, it's so fascinating. It's so amazing, and
Yeah.
it can change so much as well. It's got
Yeah.
great plasticity. It can change, and it's amazing.
Do you know much about neurofeedback?
Not a huge amount. I've read some stuff around it, and so I'm saving for my master's in neuroscience at the moment. So maybe soon I'll have a bit more information. What I know of it at the moment is stuff I've kind of taught myself through, so that I could use it in my work with people and just done short courses online. There's
Yeah.
like Bessel van der Kolk, who does a lot of the trauma work.
Uh-huh.
He does courses and stuff as well that you can learn from, and that's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm still trying to get to grips with a lot of it. I learned a lot of it through looking at chemsex, which is when your drugs and sex come together and the pathways merge. So it's like walking through a field over and over again. You kind of get that path through the field, and that's the easiest one that everyone goes to. And
Right.
that kind of happens. So when you take drugs, you want to have sex, and when you have sex, you want to have drugs, and you can't separate them then. And when you work with that kind of addiction, you have to kind of learn to let that path grow back, kind of let the grass grow and reform different neural pathways. So I learned more about it through that kind of side of things.
Does the neurofeedback help with that, like letting the grass grow in the path and like helping the person take like a step back, or how does someone I mean, it seems like what, just straight willpower? How do you really
I
like
mean, willpower is part of it. Um, Identifying triggers and figuring out your pattern. So you'll kind of start by keeping a journal of emotional feelings and when you want to do something.
mm,
So then you start to figure out what is your trigger along the way. Then you learn that cravings are something that passed. I think we think that once we get into a craving, that's it, we're stuck. They're not. They're like waves. So they will go away. You
yeah,
just got to figure out how to ride it out. And it's hard. I'm not saying that getting out of using something is easy by any stretch of the imagination. It's a really tough thing to do.
yeah,
Um, but manageable. You can do it. You can get there. But it's learning to ride that wave. And when you can start to break the craving a bit, it means that the things can separate a bit more. The kind of you learn you don't have to always go there.
yeah,
And
yeah.
then the brain starts to change the way it reacts to things. But it does just take a little bit of time, which is hard. I know. I wish I had a quick if I could solve it like that, I'd love it. But it takes a little bit of time.
I heard, and I don't know if this is for all cravings or what, but I heard like about 15 minutes, like, is how long your body would respond to being in like craving mode. And then after like 15 minutes is when it kind of starts to pass and wane.
Yeah, it's about that. It'll be different for different people, and you can do things which will help you ride it out a little bit. Again, like exercise, if you kind of get up and go for a walk, that helps. If
Mhm.
you distract yourself with something, that can help. Often in therapy, we talk about sitting in things and not distracting yourself. Actually, with cravings, it's okay to distract yourself because it actually helps you get through it. So people will learn different techniques, but yeah, they don't actually last that long. They just feel tough to resist. But
Yeah.
you can just ride that wave through. I had it described by David Stewart, who I work with a lot here around drug use, that it's like jumping into a pool, and by the time you swim out the other side of the pool, you feel a lot better. So if you jump into a pool mad, you'll feel better by the time you come out. And it's a bit like that with the
Yeah.
craving. Yeah.
I've even and not even speaking to like cravings or anything, but if I find myself feeling really frustrated or just like in a bad mood or like ruminating on something,
Yeah.
I'll even just like I'm sitting down usually, so I'll get up and walk to another room, and just leaving that room, I even start to feel like I can breathe a little bit better.
Yeah. Like when they say about exercise, you don't have to go and run, you don't have to do anything hardcore. You can just get up and walk around a bit, or get up and stretch, or get up and do something that
Yeah,
reconnects you with your body and just changes that mood around. It's good for us, and just going out and reconnecting with the world a bit. I think especially at the moment we're all existing in our own little isolated bubbles. So actually going out and feeling that you're connected to the world somehow is really important, which is traditionally what we use communities for, but they've been broken down now. So any way you can feel that you're connecting with the world again is important.
yeah, yeah, and that's another, that's community is like another fundamental,
Huge.
vastly fundamental, element for health, I guess, just overall
Yeah.
mental health.
Oh, it's hugely connection is the biggest thing. Like that's what I know some people say, well, I don't need connection. I'm happy on my own. You might be. Generally, I think, it's in one of the things with food and air and water. We do need to connect really for well-rounded mental health. So,
Yeah,
for things like trauma, they talk about singing, join a choir to help with trauma because all singing together, it's like going to a gig. If everyone's singing the song together at the same time, it gives you that amazing feeling. You can get that as well from different community activities, which will help with mental health.
yeah.
We're kind of we do need that.
So are you big on a big journaling proponent then for, like, everyone overall?
So kind of journaling about emotions and
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's brilliant as a guide to ourselves to keep a curiosity around yourself. I think one of the best things we can do for knowing about our identity, knowing about how we work and how we think, is to have a real curiosity, like we would about other people, but look inwards.
Yeah.
So if you can keep a journal and keep records of how you feel, see what's been going on for you. You can vent anything that you want to let out because we don't always have somewhere we can go to let things out. If you do all that, I mean, I've got journals that I look back from years ago and I'm like, I don't remember feeling that way, but it makes sense now. Okay, that kind of fits. So I think journaling's brilliant. It can offer a lot.
What do you say to people um, who respond with the idea of journaling and saying, "Well, like I would write the same thing over and over again," or I am, and all I'm doing is writing the same thing."
And that tells you something.
Yeah.
No, that's important. Some of the biggest things to look at in therapy, where you're stuck. So if you're repeating, what is happening? Why have you become stuck? And the things that you're not saying, what are you avoiding? What are you not saying or looking at? So actually, the repeated things and the things we choose not to say or think about are just as important as that kind of feeling like we're saying all this stuff that's showing progress. That's a lesson in itself. If you're repeating things, then okay, let's look at that. There's something going on there. Where have you become stuck? And
Mhm.
let's kind of unpick that. It's fine. I think people need to feel comfortable in the fact that there's no right way to do therapy or understand mental health. It's a big pressure. People come and go, "Oh, I'm afraid I'm not going to do it right." It's like there is no right and wrong way to do this. Let's just see what comes up and work with that. That can be a fear for people, I think.
Yeah. Are there certain kinds of therapy? I don't know. Like my brother, I think he's done is it DBT, and then I know someone else that really likes the CBT. Do you? I mean,
Yeah, there's different types. So CBT is more of a kind of goal orientated kind of therapy, and there's different types of it. I'm not sure about differences in America and the UK as well, if there are kind of different practices. And DBT I know gets used a lot for sort of personality disorders here, and kind of looking at things that might be useful there. And I do psychodynamic and person centered, so I kind of look at deep relationship stuff and how your past affects the now, any trauma. So I do some trauma informed stuff as well. Um, and it's really about finding the right one that fits you.
okay.
If it might not be your time to look deep into stuff.
Mhm.
And so then maybe go for something which is a little bit more like CBT, which will help you cope, which will help you find, strategies for getting through difficult times and anxieties. And so that might be really useful. And once you've got to your goal where you want to be, then maybe you want to look back.
Yeah.
Not everybody is going to need the same thing at different times in their life.
Right. So that's a good point is it is it's like phases. You know, what
Hmm.
you need are like chapters in a book, what you need at that time to kind of resolve and then move to the next phase.
Yeah. So, I mean, I was a practitioner. I work with people who are still using drugs and alcohol. I don't have an abstinence practice, so people can choose how they want to reduce or if they want to reduce what they want to do. Um, but I will know that at certain stages in drug and alcohol use, you're probably not going to want to go back into trauma because then you might just want to use more. So it's kind of gauging, well, where are you at? What do you need at this time? And how do you then find the right therapy for you? And
Yeah.
try different types out.
Mhm.
If you try one, it doesn't work, that's fine. Go try another one. You'll need to find the right practitioner and the right style for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um do you I feel like I know and keep meeting more and more people who are bipolar. Um any thoughts, tips, anything regarding bipolar for someone listening?
I mean, I guess it depends where you're up to because I work with a few people who struggle with bipolar, and it depends if you want to use medication or not. I actually think I know there are some people who are very against using medication. I think if it gives you headspace and it helps, fine. Find what works for you. Um, it is a hard one because the biggest struggle is feeling that you don't have control over how you feel. So there can be a real wanting to pull back control. Um, and so it's kind of learning techniques for managing when you're in the certain headspace. So it's a bit hard because everyone's got a different way that they might feel when they're in kind of the manic stage or they're in the depressive stage, and it's really learning what you need to soothe you,
Mhm.
what you need to put in place to feel safe, so that you feel that even if you don't have full control, you do feel safe.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, but it's something that I'd need to kind of really look at somebody and or how they experience it to know what's
Right.
best.
Right.
But if you find a therapist and you talk through what you need, where you feel most unsafe, where you feel that you want to reach out and get a little bit of help and learn about regulation the best that you can, then someone will be able to put a plan together for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The few people I do know, the one thing that they all say helps them, again, is exercise.
Yeah. Exercise is such a good thing. I mean, I'll be honest, there's people like, I just love going to the gym. I don't. Like, I go because I think, well, not at the moment, they're real shut, but I exercise because I feel like I have to.
Mhm.
But do you know what? The mental benefits are good. It is a really important thing. And even if it is just having a stretch or having a dance around or just connecting to something that makes you feel good for a little bit,
Yeah.
it's hugely important. Yeah.
It's funny though because what I usually do is like walk like power. I hate the name power walking, but it's what I mean. I walk as fast as some people jog.
Right.
So, but that's what I do because I've just accepted because I'll end up making myself feel bad and get in this loop of like guilt and just feeling bad about myself that I don't like exercising. I don't like going to the gym. And so it's like this feels like I'm creating more stress, by like forcing myself to do
Yeah.
something. So it's like I think just I don't know. It's just like everyone is different, I feel like, and just remembering that.
Yeah, and it's if you do exercise knowing that, okay, this is something that could benefit my mind and that's what I want from it. So even if I just go for a walk, it's not about like hitting it hard and burning as many calories as you can. And yeah, like the gym, they're not a natural habitat of mine by any stretch. So if I go into it thinking I'm doing this for my mental health, it feels a little bit easier. I
Yeah,
can just, yeah.
yeah, that's true. And there'll be days where like if I don't go for a walk or don't do something like physically active after a few days, I can feel it, and it just like yeah, like all of your chemistry starts changing and it just feels off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm lucky I have a dog, so I
Right.
have to go out walking with her. Um, but it's actually really good for me because it does get me out, and I do. It feels different walking a dog. You kind of got company, so
Yeah,
I like chat away to her as we're going. Like she doesn't care, but
yeah,
and it does get me out, and I go and explore. The good thing about leaving and moving back up north to where I'm from is just outside of Liverpool, is there are fields and canals and it's really nice and fresh air. So lots of areas to explore and just connecting with nature a little bit is really nice.
yeah.
The strange thing is actually that trees are really good to to think about in therapy. And we use the idea of trees quite a lot because they're grounded and they've got good roots and they grow and they kind of grow how they want to grow. We don't try and cut them down. So you know, it sounds a bit strange, but actually getting out amongst trees can be a really beneficial thing because they can represent a lot to us too. It's even talking to a lot of clients, and what I tend to do is try and encourage clients to find joy. It's something we lose focus on as we become adults. So trying to reconnect with joy a lot. And a lot of people get joy from being around trees and being around nature. So um and they are good because if you sit by one, they are quite strong and you can feel the roots and kind of connect to that side of things. I just think I'm going on about trees a lot here, but I really do think they're really important.
Do you have any like I guess yeah, anything else, any final thoughts or practical tips that you could pass on to anyone looking to maybe clean up their act or find some balance or start to kind of heal themselves?
I think the first thing with any process, and particularly if you're looking at kind of cleaning up your act or making changes, is to have a compassion for yourself first of all, because we can get caught up in shame cycles, and shame can keep us trapped in a lot. Um, we all get caught up in things sometimes that aren't the best for us, but it's often developed as a protection thing or it started for a reason. We're all just trying to get through life and we find that we're coping the best way that we can. It's just perhaps not the best one for us. So start off, have a compassion, that our younger selves have got us through a lot. They might have got us into a bit of trouble along the way. I know my younger self did. My teenager was a bit of a mess at times, but she got through. So if we can develop that kind of self compassion, that's a really important thing to start. Um, Talk about shame if you can. So if you find a therapist, find one that you feel really comfortable with. I know we talked about the different types of therapy, but ultimately the most important thing is a relationship between you and the therapist.
Yeah.
Find someone that you feel you can talk to, that you're not going to hide anything from. Because again, you don't want to keep shame hidden and it'll just grow more. So find someone you can talk about the stuff that feels difficult, because shame, once it's brought out into the light, will start to dissipate.
Mhm.
And shame can keep us in a lot that we don't want to be in. So
Yeah.
they're important parts.
Is there anything, because a close friend of mine, he struggles, and I mean, I know he's like working on it, but he struggles with shame a
Mm.
lot. Um, is that even a thing that I mean, I know there's like books about it and stuff. Is there something that, like, I don't know, tips about or advice about dealing with shame?
I mean, the main thing to know about shame is often it's the way we view it and the way we view ourselves is way worse than when we actually speak about it. We have things that we feel shame around, which is that kind of feeling where you're like, oh, I'm ashamed that that happened.
Mhm.
But then it can develop to be what we call toxic shame, which is I am a bad person. I am shameful. And that's when it gets to a point where we kind of develop narratives about ourselves. So if you can find a way to take out the narratives, write them down, or do something where there's like I am statements, when you see them all written down, then you can start to pull them apart, because a lot of them will have developed at times when we don't need them anymore, or they're actually not true.
Mhm.
Um, but shame, the biggest thing is to take it out so that it can be normalized and so that it can be dealt with compassion, talking about it, which feels like the worst thing. I'm a big I think having community groups is really important for that. Meeting people who have shared experiences. Actually, at the moment, a lot of support groups have gone online, which means, in a way, it's easier because you don't even have to put your camera on. And you can just sit and hear other people share their stories who perhaps have been there a bit longer and feel more prepared. So, joining a support group is really, I think, can be essential for working through shame,
Yeah.
because we're, huge amounts of people carry shame,
Yeah.
and huge amounts of people feel similar things that we might. So,
Do
if we
you
can
know
share in that.
do you know of any, support groups that might focus on shame? Do you?
Not There possibly are ones for shame specifically, but generally, people I work with will go to more kind of specific groups for kind of alcohol or drug use, or perhaps eating disorders,
Mhm.
sex addiction, love addiction. So a lot of that, I mean, addiction generally comes from trauma and shame.
Right.
Um, they
Right.
found the links between trauma, shame, and addiction are quite high. So even just going and having conversation with people who've been through similar experiences.
Yeah.
And community groups, there used to be one in London, and I think they're around Europe, possibly even in America, I don't know, called Let's Talk About Gay Sex and Drugs, and then Let's Talk About Sex and Drugs. And they were just where people would get together and it'd be like an open mic night, but talking about struggles, or there'd be cabaret and comedy and music, and but all around stuff that could be traditionally seen as quite dark or quite difficult to talk about. And that was amazing because it just got people there going, yeah, I had this problem, but actually it's okay now, and I can kind of laugh about it, or I can talk about it or sing about it.
It adds a
That
whole,
kind of stuff
like,
is,
element of comfort and
yeah,
definite
huge.
relatability to it. Oh, that's
Yeah, so I think things like that are great. If you can kind of, I reckon if you look around at film, music, there's lots of stuff in there that we can relate to.
yeah. Do you have any, aside from that one, book that you mentioned earlier, do you have any other books that you think are awesome for people that, maybe check out?
I mean, the main one I recommend to people is The Body Keeps the Score, by Bessel van der Kolk, which is all about trauma and how we hold it in the body, explains a lot about the mind and how that works. So I always recommend that one. That's really important. Um, then depending on what you're looking at, I mean that's probably the main one. There's one called Lost Connections as well, but I'm trying to think what the author's called, and that's about kind of depression and medication as well, which is really interesting.
Okay.
Um, it's somebody talking about their journey through. So
Gotcha.
there's a couple of interesting books which were kind of around general mental health. I
Yeah.
actually really like the Ruby Wax books. I don't know if you've ever read them, but Ruby Wax, like the comedian, don't know, she is American, but I think over here, and she did a series of books on mindfulness,
Oh,
and
really?
they're actually really good. Yeah, they've
Cool.
actually got some pretty useful stuff in. So,
Okay.
I think one's called Sane New World, but she's done a few now, so they're really good too.
Cool.
Um, yeah.
So, with the first book that you mentioned, have you noticed with your clients if there have you observed like a correlation between physical pain and yeah, emotional
Yeah.
trauma stuff?
Yeah, I mean, we hold trauma in our body so much. So, and often you can find that the place where the pain is held or the sensation is held is connected to what might be being held in or the trauma that was experienced. So you get like my throat's going today, but that's because I was sick earlier in the week. This isn't a trauma thing, but a lot of the time people will hold stuff in the throat, so they'll get throat ache, they'll get lockjaw, they'll get different problems, and it's because they're not saying what they need to say. So sometimes if there's a trauma being held in and there's stuff that isn't expressed, you get problems around this part of the body. Um, I work a lot with people who've experienced sexual trauma, so that will often be held in the lower part of the body. Um, there will also be perhaps where people have been touched in the past in ways they didn't like. They will feel it there, and things like yoga are amazing for releasing that.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, breathing is really good for it. Yoga is incredible because actually when we connect with that part of the body, you can cry, you can release things. It actually brings a lot of it out. So yoga, we hugely recommend for that. You don't have to be good at it. Um, you don't have to be able to be super bendy or flexible. Or I'm not.
Yeah.
Um, but just having a go at it and connecting with the different parts of the body, really important. It's
Wow.
really good for it. Yeah.
Cool. Um, what's your favorite quote?
My favorite quote is by Jung, and I'm gonna have to I'll probably get it wrong, so people can correct me. But it's about how if we keep the unconscious hidden, we kind of call it fate. So it's all about how if we have the subconscious, and if we choose to ignore it, we just carry it through life, and we call it fate. And I think that's really important because what we do is we just repeat the same patterns, and we think, well, this is just my life. I did it. I was like, why do I always end up with these people that treat me this way? Why do I always end up in these situations? This is just fate. This is just what I'm destined to like go through. And it's not. It's often an unconscious process. It's happening underneath. If you can look at that, identify it, and take it out, then we can move forward in a different way.
Yeah.
So it's not fate. We don't have a set pattern. We're not guaranteed to do the same thing. We can change it.
Mhm. Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And I've murdered that Jungian quote. So any Jungian therapists out there want to write the actual quote,
You
great.
paraphrased.
I
So,
paraphrased, yeah. I mean, I got the general gist.
yeah, and that's why the word paraphrase exists in the vocabulary.
Exactly.
It's
When you
so
can't remember the actual words.
yeah. Um, so is there anything, coming up or coming out that you're working on you wanna share or talk more about the podcast or anything?
Um, the podcast, I've got a few different guests coming up, hopefully, where I'm going to cover different topics around women in horror and different kind of sexuality in horror, identity. Um, I did my kind of dissertation thing on gender and sexuality, and then that's where I kind of wanted to. I find that as a really fascinating world, so I'm going to be exploring a bit more of that in the podcast as well. Um, hopefully, the book will be out, and I'm actually looking at working on another book which is about experiences of abuse as well. So there's a few different projects coming up. See how they come together, but it takes forever. I was like, yeah, I'm gonna write a book. It'll probably take me like 6 months, and like 2 years down the line, you're like, oh, it takes so long. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, because you keep I don't know, you have new ideas and going back and rehashing and
Yeah.
adding to, and then your brain just turns to mashed potatoes and
It's yeah, and the thing is that I decided stupidly, I was like, "I'm gonna do this book that's a mix of knowledge and art." I can't draw,
yeah,
so I've had to so I've had to get a lot of other people in to do the artwork,
and
and
that
I was
took
like,
forever.
yeah. So then I've now tried to leave myself kinda orchestrating that, and so but I've got some amazing people involved, people from, different worlds, so, musicians that I used to know from that world, and then people from the film world, and so I wanna kind of bring it all together and see how that kinda comes together, hopefully, at some point.
So, yeah, thank you so much for being here. I feel like there was a lot of like pauses and thinking on my end because it's like I love the brain and talking about this stuff and I can't ask questions fast enough because I'm too busy like absorbing it and just being fascinated by it. But thank you for sharing everything.
No, thank you. I have the opposite. I feel like I rambled for all through it. I just go. If somebody like asks a question, I answer about 10 different things at once because my
Yeah,
brain's so active. But so hopefully it made some sense.
it made
Hopefully
perfect
it
sense.
was
And all
okay.
the rambles are just like gems. It's all these just gems in there. So it's perfect.
Good. I'm glad it makes sense to people
Yeah,
because I have a habit of going off on a tangent. It's like, where did I go? Okay, pull that back to where I was meant
it's
to
all
be.
interesting. It's all good. All right. Well, thank you. Have a good rest of your day, and maybe we can do this again.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I'd love to. This project's amazing. I love bringing music together, and I feel like finally, just by doing this, I've managed to bring my music degree and my therapy degree somehow and make them useful. Yes. So thank you for making the first 4 years of study
Yeah.
worth something.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.